So I had a source visiting me at my house. His first name is Brett. And he was on his way back from the Middle East, and he brought back with him a challenge coin. I don't know if anyone here knows what that is, but it's kind of a bar drinking coin, if you will. And on one side of it, it said Kabul, Afghanistan, and on the other side, it said U.S. Department of State. And my source, Brett, has nothing to do with diplomacy. He's weapons trained. And so I had an idea, while he couldn't say what he was doing in the Middle East, it was pretty clear to me that it was some kind of an intelligence organization operation. My two boys at the time were young, and I had a number of, we had G.I. Joes all over the garden, from the Revolutionary War to the present tense. And the G.I. Joes have these little weapons that go with them, and they had messed them all up. And Brett said to the boys, let me show you how this works. And he was, explaining to them, and they were fascinated. I mean, they were 5 and 10 at the time. And afterwards, he said, listen, if it's okay with your mom and dad, I will show you a real weapon. Now, I know Brett is a licensed weapons safety instructor, so I said that was fine. And he opens up this case, and inside of it, and he puts together this rifle with a scope. And I live up in Hollywood in a canyon, and he set it up on the dining room table, and through that scope, I could see across the canyon, and I could see the veins on a leaf. And I thought to myself, now I know what Brett does in Afghanistan. The boys went off, and there was another case there that he never opened. There was a couple different weapons that he showed them, but the one that he didn't open, I was very curious about. I'm a journalist. So when we were alone, I said, what's in that case? And he opened it up, and inside there was a large knife with a serrated edge. And I said, what's that for? Immediately realizing my naivete. And he said, sometimes a job requires quiet. Why I wanted to write this book is not as much what operators do overseas, but as much about my reaction to it. In other words, I could accept Brett or anyone, with this clinical idea of a sniper rifle, but the idea of using a knife, slitting someone's throat or sticking it in their ribs really gave me pause. And I was interested in that idea. I was interested in why we as citizens differentiate between different forms of killing, pass judgments on what others are doing about that, from the president to the ground pounder. And I tried for a very long time to write about the CIA's paramilitary. I had heard from another source that Brett was with a very elite, very specialized wing of the CIA's Special Activities Division, which is called Ground Branch. And almost no one knows about it or talks about it. And it took me a very long time as a journalist to find sources who were willing to speak with me about Ground Branch and about the Special Activities Division. And that is how I came to write this book. Now, surprise, kill, vanish. So the story begins in World War II. In the motto of the OSS Jedburghs, which is the precursor organization to the CIA, was surprise, kill, vanish. And it involved operators jumping out of aircraft into Nazi-occupied France and elsewhere. They would land on the ground. They would team up with indigenous force partners. So the Jedburghs worked in France. They would team up with their French partners. They would, surprise their way in. They would kill Nazis with a knife. They had a specialized knife to do so. And then they would vanish. And so that became their motto. And this became very interesting to me. And what the book is about is that idea of, is war a gentleman's game? Or is it something that one must do the dirtiest, as they called it back in World War II, most dastardly things possible to win. And when we think of the Nazis, I think many of us we find it easier to imagine throat slitting because they're Nazis. But if you move forward to today, we ask ourselves, why is it that we are making those judgments? My main character is a guy called Billy Wall, and he's the longest serving CIA operative in its history that is known. So there may be someone that's longer, but we don't know about it. And his story is interesting because he was a young soldier in the Korean War, and he was a ground pounder. I mean, he was an infantryman, and he hated it, and he thought war was dreadful and boring. And after that, he learned about this secret unit inside the army that was being started, and that was what would become the Green Berets. And so through his story, I demonstrate that most of the operators who work in this world, and they're called operators, not soldiers, they are military trained. So they become what are called Tier 1 operators, Delta, Green Berets, SEALs, this is all in the present tense, MARSOC, PJs, and they retire and they go over and work for the agency. So many of the individuals who work in this world are older. And I found that very interesting, and I'm jumping ahead to the end of the book because I write history, I write chronology. So I take you through the different wars and the different transformations of the CIA's paramilitary army. But when I landed in the present day, I found it fascinating, and I want you to think about this, particularly when we have a discussion about this, the second half, which is that most of the kids, and I've also interviewed soldiers who are working for the military, and they're much younger. And so there is that idea when it comes to morality and when it comes to what is at stake and why are we doing what we are doing. I was constantly confronted with the idea that young soldiers are heading into war at 18, 19, often really not knowing what they are in for. And the operators at the agency who are working for the Special Activities Division are, veterans of decades, and they are the ones who are saying, in essence, send me. And they are willing to surprise, kill, and vanish. What we're talking about here with this paramilitary capacity is called tertia optia, and that means third option. So up until right after World War II, the president had two options. There was diplomacy, that's the first option, trying to work things out with our foreign partners or our foreign adversaries from a diplomatic standpoint. And the second option is when that doesn't work, war. So the third option is the CIA. And that idea is really that once diplomacy has failed and war is unwise, you rely upon the third option. It's also called the president's hidden hand. Everything that is done by the CIA's paramilitary is meant to be plausibly denied. It is also called covert action. And for this reason, we as the citizenry learn about a lot of the CIA's mistakes because they become public. And so one of the extraordinary things for me as a journalist and as an author is piecing together what is on the record. So for example, many people in this room may know about Guatemala, the CIA's meddlings in Guatemala, or in Iran, or at the Bay of Pigs, the failed paramilitary operation. But what you don't know is the operations that were successful because they are meant to be plausibly denied. And I write about those different operations in the book as I weave together this story of how and why the President's Guerrilla Warfare Corps came to be. A fascinating thing happened during Vietnam, I learned, and that is that So the Pentagon operates under what is called Title 10, and there are rules of engagement that soldiers must adhere to. The CIA operates under what is called Title 50, and both of these are elements of the National Security Code that came out of the creation of the Pentagon and the national security apparatus in 1947. But Title 50 and Title 10 are very, very different. And what I learned in looking through JFK's archives was that the Bay of Pigs impacted the president so greatly. I mean, he was humiliated in his first 100 days as president after having won the election on a very specific position that, communism must be defeated. And sort of Cuba and Vietnam were at the top of his target list. And to have that failure at the Bay of Pigs infuriated President Kennedy. And he did something which, in my opinion, has not really been looked at or reported before. And what he did was he switched the authority of the covert operations from the CIA, working under Title 50, to the Defense Department, working under Title 10. And it got very messy there in terms of these covert paramilitary operations that were happening in the very, very early days of Vietnam. This is long before war was declared by President Johnson, or Congress declared war. And that was very interesting from a historical point of view, because you see that same thing today. Or I should say, do you see that same thing today? And of course, I let readers decide, or I try to let readers decide, and come to their own conclusions about these bigger, sweeping issues that affect all of us as citizens. After the Vietnam War, any kind of paramilitary or military force was so looked down upon. The Special Forces was gutted. The CIA's paramilitary was essentially reduced to nil. The Church Committee took the CIA almost down. And this idea was, no one wants anything to do with guerrilla warfare, with paramilitary. It's dark, it's dirty, it's ugly. It is not a gentleman's game. It is not a gentleman's warfare game. And really, the citizens of the United States didn't want anything to do with war, period. But it was a very, very important point in the CIA's history, because you had a whole bunch of operators without work. And I write about that in the book, about this moment where sort of they're not needed. And there's this lull in a lot of activity until Reagan takes office. Now, I'm going to actually interrupt my own self for a minute here and tell you, you often hear the expression tip of the spear. That's what we call the Special Forces operators. Well, the tip of the spear is assassination. It is the ultimate guerrilla warfare capacity that the CIA has. And it has existed since 1947, since Title 50 was created. There's lots of mythology around it. I explain very clearly through declassified documents and first-hand interviews with sources about how this has evolved over time. But to give you an indication of how specific it is, President Eisenhower called his assassination capacity the Health Alteration Committee. So I have located documents in the National Archive that refer to, this is a mission for the Health Alteration Committee. President Kennedy called it executive action. Jumping forward to Reagan, he called it preemptive neutralization. Bush called it lethal direct action, and Obama called it targeted killing. So going back now to after the Vietnam War, you had President Reagan developing a capacity for preemptive neutralization. And this is because we saw the first rise of terrorism. What I also found very interesting, and I interview a gentleman named Louis Merletti for this book, and he was the 19th director of the Secret Service. He went on the record in this book to explain to us how the capacity to protect the President of the United States is kind of the flip side of the coin of this executive action capacity, or preemptive neutralization capacity, if you will. And that comes from the fact, as CIA Director Richard Helms so famously said, if you have a capacity to take out someone else's leaders, why wouldn't they take out yours? I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he said. So you begin to understand how serious this all gets behind the scenes. President Reagan develops preemptive neutralization with a CIA director who is a fascinating man named Bill Casey. And where did Bill Casey's experience come from? He was with the OSS. And so one of the reasons why I love writing history so much is we begin to see how all of these threads pull together toward the present tense, because you have individuals running the show. Not the CIA in particular is an organization really run by individuals, as opposed to the Pentagon, which is really an organization that functions like a bureaucracy. Lou Merletti explained for this book about a very interesting, largely unreported organization called the Counter Assault Team, CAT Team. And what I found fascinating about this, largely unknown, is that starting after President Reagan was almost killed by an assassin in 1981, the CAT Team began to shadow the president 24/7, and they still do. And all of those CAT Team operators are Tier 1 trained. So some of them that would go over to the CIA's paramilitary instead go over to the CAT Team, Lou Merletti being one of them. Like Billy Waugh, he was a Green Beret in Vietnam. And Merletti went on to work to protect the president, and Waugh is moving forward working offensive operations for CIA. The period of time, what I also find interesting is that we as citizens kind of tend to think that Republican presidents act one way and Democratic presidents act another way. And I found in reporting this book that was not true. The CIA's paramilitary army works at the president's behest. So there is no such thing as a rogue CIA operation as far as I know. They are directed, the order comes from the president through the CIA director on down. And there was one exception, and that was President Clinton, who really opposed executive action, preemptive neutralization, health alteration, call it what you will. And as I report in the book, based on interviews with the CIA's attorney who was writing up some of these memos, and a number of the operators who were working on these missions for the president, whenever they would request that an individual be preemptively neutralized, it would go up the chain of the command to the president, and President Clinton would reject that. And why I found this interesting is one's own morality, going back to that initial spark that made me want to write this book, because one of the people that Billy Waugh was, my main character, was targeting for the CIA in Sudan was Osama bin Laden, and this was in 1992. And there are a couple different versions of the story that I report in the book, but Waugh took the very first surveillance photographs of bin Laden in Khartoum and requested to kill bin Laden. And this went up the chain of command to President Clinton, who was very against preemptive neutralization, and he said, please don't ever ask me anything like that again. So it really makes you think about these different consequences that come out of this shadow world of hidden hand operations. In conclusion, sort of, as I get to the end of the book, what really just sort of sent things off into a completely other direction, knowing all this history, as I had learned through the research and reporting, was seeing what happened after 9/11. The paramilitary capacity of the CIA had been reduced dramatically in the Clinton era. And in the Bush administration, on September 17th, there's a very famous memorandum, parts of which are now declassified. I spoke to the lawyer who wrote that memorandum, and it gave the CIA capacity like it had never had before. And this is where we are now. The Special Activities Division has transformed from a smaller element of the agency with a lot of people who they themselves called knuckle draggers, to now being what is called the Special Activities Center, which is an interdisciplinary center. And it's bigger than it has ever been. We operate, as far as I understand, the CIA's paramilitary capacity operates in 134 countries around the globe. The hallmark of that guerrilla warfare capacity is the ability to work with the indigenous force partners. It's what we did as I told you in the beginning, we did with the OSS in France and elsewhere, in Vietnam, all over the globe. And so that is a primary driver, is working with partners. And as I report in the book, and this is where it gets very dark and disturbing, is that the partners that we have in the current wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are very difficult and troublesome partners. And while I expected in reporting it to see a lot of sort of darkness and complexity in the early years, where I really found it was in the latter years, because I also found a sense from some of these operators that are working multiple tours for the agency, this sense that they almost can no longer work with their partners. I get into the details in the book, but it has to do with fundamentally different ways of life. And it also has to do with a lot of drug abuse by, for example, the Afghan partners. And this becomes incredibly complex for CIA paramilitary operators who are highly trained. I mean, one of the things that everyone I interviewed, and I interviewed 42 guys from the Special Activities Division who are working the current wars, and one of the things they must do is take a polygraph test regularly. I mean, they cannot lie, and they must maintain a physical capacity where they can do things like halo jump into behind enemy lines or into the war theater. Halo being high altitude, low opening. That's the surprise. They must kill, and then they must vanish. They must exfiltrate without being caught. And the degree of training that they have up against the degree of training and commitment that our indigenous force partners have is really a great paradox, and and it's a difficult conundrum. So I'm going to leave you with this last thought. That first time that the source came to me in 2009, and I saw that stiletto knife, and I realized the way in which the paramilitary capacity works, that one has to be willing to do a job that requires quiet. You're talking very close up. And it made me ask, my own self, is this uncomfortable? Do I think it's right? Do I think it's wrong? And what it left me with is a real desire to know, is it necessary? And for that reason, I traveled with Billy Waugh, my main source. He threads throughout the whole narrative, to two of the last communist countries in the world. Because this all began during the Cold War. The guerrilla warfare, the President's Guerrilla Warfare Corps, the CIA's paramilitary army, was created to beat back the Russians, to defend against communism. So Billy Waugh and I traveled to Cuba, and we traveled to Vietnam. And the reason we went to both of those places was in Cuba, we met with the son of Che Guevara. And I don't know if it's well known, but the CIA, Che Guevara was killed by the CIA. It was a CIA mission. So it was Bolivian Rangers who actually killed Che. But the officer on the ground, Felix Rodriguez, I interviewed for the book. And that was in 1967, 50 years ago, 52 years ago. And so there we were, Billy Waugh and I, sitting with Ernesto Guevara in a cigar club with photographs on the wall of Che Guevara and Castro plotting the downfall of the United States, talking about war, talking about guerrilla warfare. And it really made me wonder, it's not is it right or wrong? Is it right or is it wrong? Is it necessary? And again, I had that same feeling when Billy Waugh and I traveled to Vietnam to meet with the son of General Jacques, who was the commander of the North Vietnamese Army, who so many people lost their lives in that Vietnam War. It was a turning point in American history. It was a turning point in the CIA's paramilitary armies. And there was Billy Waugh and I meeting with General Jacobsen. Waugh had been specifically assigned to lead the team from the air that killed General Jacques. They failed. Jacques died just a few years ago at the age of 103, I think he was. And we sat there, Billy Waugh and the man who had been assigned to kill Billy Waugh and his colleagues in this garden of this home owned by General Jacques. And again, I asked myself, not is it right or is it wrong, but is it necessary? So I'll leave you with that thought. I'll open up for questions, and I really look forward to what you guys have to say. Thank you so much.
You mentioned the ground branch, and I was wondering, looking at the cover, do you address an air branch or a marine branch?
Good question. You have some information that not everyone in the room has. So the CIA's paramilitary capacity is called ground branch, air branch, and maritime branch. And I wrote an entire book about air branch without even knowing it. Without knowing that it was called. I wrote a book called Area 51, which is about the CIA's early spy plane programs out at Area 51, the U-2 and the A-12 Oxcart. And I interviewed 75 men from the agency, Air Force pilots, not knowing that it was called Air Branch. So the nomenclature behind all of this is jealously guarded. I really look forward to the person who can write about maritime branch, because I know of a few operations that are just stunning, that took place in the water, on the water. So to answer your question, this book really deals with ground branch, the guys on the ground, but there are other books to be written, and I look forward to reading them. Yes, right here.
Sorry I was late. It's hard finding a parking place. So I haven't heard the last few minutes, but I saw in the paper that you were going to be here, and I want to buy your book and read it. I was immediately taken back to the fact that we're all raised in a court of law system where if I'm charged with a crime, I get my day in court, I get a lawyer, I'm innocent, supposedly innocent until proven guilty. But these people are outlaws. Okay, these people are criminals. This is my opinion. I'm not speaking to anybody else. They should bring in somebody who they think is a murderer or a criminal and charge him. I'm sure that on the other side, in Vietnam and Cuba, Indonesia, they want to put people like Kissinger on trial for crimes he's committed in their countries. So I'm looking forward to reading your book, but I still maintain that the CIA is an outlaw outfit. They're not under anybody's control. You even said it's run by individuals. John Kirikoff, you might know about him. He's a whistleblower from the CIA. He spoke to us recently about Venezuela, and he said that Venezuela idea came up with one person going to an assistant director and said, we need to invade and overthrow Venezuela, put our puppet in there, knock out their elected official, go after the minerals and oil. And so they went to the DOJ, Department of Justice, got permission, threw it to the president. He signed off on it, goes back to